I'm Kevin O'Brien, Director of the Ignatian Formation Initiatives with the Office of Ignatian Spirituality of the Eastern Province Jesuits. In response to the current crisis in our world, our office has invited several gifted practitioners to share with us their insights on how we and those we accompany might stay spiritually, emotionally, and physically healthy as we navigate this time of COVID. In today's program, our presenter, Nicholas Collura, will consider experiences of grief in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to his work as a spiritual director and retreat director at St. Raphaela Center outside Philadelphia, Nicholas is a member of the Association of Professional Chaplains and works as a palliative care chaplain. He studied film and literature at Yale University and the University of Paris before earning a Master's of Divinity degree from the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where he also trained as a spiritual director. Beyond his work in healthcare, Nicholas spent 3 years of his life as a Jesuit on the West Coast, where he ministered on college campuses, in juvenile halls and state prisons, and at a L'Arche community in the Pacific Northwest. Nicholas, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. And hello, everyone. It's really good to be here with you. And you know, I'm so sorry that I can't see you all right now. That's one thing that we can grieve, is the lack of ability to make eye contact so easily as we normally would. And yet you are there. And I just want to reverently acknowledge your presence. And perhaps even as we're beginning, we can take a moment to reverently acknowledge one another's presence. I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully you can all now see this candle, although you may also wish to close your eyes instead if you prefer. Just to take a moment to recognize that we are here sharing this moment together. We're in communion with one another in time, if not in space. Whether we call this prayer or reverent acknowledgement, just take a moment of silence to acknowledge the fact that we are here in this together, to imagine all of the other people who are watching this live and later on, or if you're watching this after it's been recorded, to imagine all of the other people who have been here with you in this experience together. Just take a moment to acknowledge one another's presence. Amen. Thank you. I want to say that although there's a PowerPoint slide here, this is not going to be a death by PowerPoint kind of presentation. And so as a matter of fact, I'd like to invite you, even before we begin talking about grief, to feel free to stand, to stretch, even for the duration of the 40 or 45 minutes that we're going to be together. You know, this is one thing that we can't typically do when we're gathering together for a talk in person. If you have the space and the privacy and you feel comfortable doing so, feel free to move your body. I know that I've done a lot of Zoom events and sometimes it's mind numbing. It's actually harder for me sometimes to concentrate on material when I'm sitting at a computer. I'm tempted to open up a tab. So if you're the kind of person who would like to dust your room or do some yoga and just listen, rest assured that I'll call your attention to the slides when it's helpful to glance at the computer screen. But it can be really good to stretch our bodies. I find sometimes if I stretch one way for 30 seconds and then come back to center, even before I stretch the other way, I can feel the blood flowing through one part of my body, one side of my body, and I can tell what a difference just a little bit of stretching does when we're cooped up or when we're behind a computer desk for so long. So feel free to do that. And the last thing I would say is that grief, just like many feelings and just like trauma, is carried in the body. And all of us carry it a little bit differently. Some of us will get headaches. Some of us, our stomach will be twisted up in knots, but we might not even realize necessarily that we're feeling that until we actually start paying attention to our body. And we say, wow, you know, my breathing is actually a bit constricted, like I have a constriction or a tightness in my chest. And that can be grief. Or even this invitation to get up and move around, I feel like a sluggishness or an exhaustion. That too can be, if not, you know, the sum total of the grief experience that we're carrying, it can be a part of how we're doing psychosomatically. So probably we've all heard stories about people doing yoga, or we've experienced this ourselves, where just one yoga position brings forth this emotion. We find ourselves with tears in our eyes. Grief is so often carried in our body. So this is just an invitation to receive this webinar in whatever way feels appropriate to you. If it's a way that involves moving your body, please, please do. And be attentive to whatever's stirring inside of you as we talk. So I'm going to begin just by talking a little bit about grief theory. This isn't going to be too technical. I hope that it feels as much like a retreat as like a webinar, insofar as it's an opportunity to look within and to name some of our own experience of grief during this time of COVID. You know, my guess is that for many of us, when we think about grief, we think immediately of the 5 stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, these famous 5 stages. I'm not even going to try to name them because I get mixed up in what order they are supposedly supposed to come in, bargaining, acceptance, anger, and so on. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, when she talked about these stages that we all know fairly well, even she said, you know, these aren't meant to be gone through linearly. These aren't a checklist that all grief consists of is, okay, I've been through this one, and then next I'm going to go through this one. People experience grief very differently and very individually according to who they are and where they are and what they're grieving. There's no universal way of expressing grief. And there may not even be a better or worse way of experiencing grief. And so in recognition of the fact that everyone's story is different, contemporary grief theorists have talked more about narrative approaches. Robert Niemeyer is an example here, whose name I put on the slide. But basically what that means is we understand loss as a disruption in our system of meaning. Something in our story and the meaning that we attach to our life story changes when we go through grief. And we need to grapple with that. That's basically what I mean by narrative approaches, that a lot of contemporary grief theorists say, the point is to figure out what is our story and how does this one particular loss impact our story. And, you know, I think that's why grief, seeing it as a question of narrative disruption, and boy, is this pandemic ever a massive narrative disruption, it's important to name grief, not to make us depressed, not to bring up feelings that we wouldn't have felt or experienced on subconscious level anyway, but rather so that we can figure out what's happening in our story and we can write the next chapter with greater freedom. So for me, that's the idea behind naming grief in a time of pandemic or in any time of loss or change. You know, for those of us who have roots or belong to the Judeo-Christian tradition, we might be aware that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, naming things gives us incredible power. So in the Genesis narrative, for example, God allows Adam to name the various creatures as a way of saying, this is your dominion over them. Or in this famous scene, which is depicted by Paul Gauguin, this is Jacob wrestling the angel. And you know, Jacob, after he wrestles the angel, he's renamed. He becomes Israel, meaning one who has contended with God. The idea being that at this crucial kind of pivotal moment in his life story, it's appropriate to rename himself, to honor and reflect what has happened. And so we can think about the power of naming as we go through this time together, naming the things that we're grieving, naming the changes that we're trying to adapt to. So having said that we've moved away a little bit from stage theory, I do actually want to go to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's book here, and you've got it there. And if you can see my little icon in the corner, I've got the book right here. It's a wonderful guide to grieving. And I'm actually going to read a bit from one of the last chapters in this book, which is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, this great grief theorist, talking about her own grief timeline. And we might all at some point in our life want to sit down and write out a grief timeline. And what that is basically an account of all the little and big things that we've grieved over the course of our life. It doesn't just have to be deaths. It can be the loss of a job. It can be a loss of innocence. It can be a move from a home or the end of a relationship. All of these different forms of grief kind of come to play and affect the rest of the grieving that we do going on, because grief stays with us in some profound way. Our relationship to it might change, but grief really stays with us. And to the extent that we haven't processed all the griefs that we experience over the course of our life, another big grief later on down the line might trigger them. So I'm just going to read a brief passage from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross where she kind of illustrates this idea. And in case you needed a dose of cuteness in your day today, here's a picture of Kubler-Ross with her two sisters. They were triplets. And she writes in the story about how one of the first things that she had to grieve in her life was a loss of individuality, because everywhere she went, she was just one of a triad and always felt like her own personal importance or personal existence was erased. It was invisible. So she kind of had to grieve that, but didn't really get the chance. Because here's what she has to say about growing up. To never feel that I uniquely mattered was a lesson that would help me recognize later how much people meant to each other and how every loss, large or small, matters. But I also learned early on not to grieve for myself, not to cry and not to feel. During my childhood, we always had bunnies around the house, and I loved each and every one of them. The problem was my father was thrifty, and every 6 months he needed to roast a bunny for our dinner. I would have to bring the beloved bunnies one by one to the butcher. But I always made sure that my own special bunny, Blackie, was never chosen. He was mine, the one love object I had that belonged only to me. But she goes on to write about the fact that eventually, and you can kind of imagine where the story is going, her father told her that indeed she did have to bring in the bunny to the butcher, this Blackie, the one that she loved most of all, and how poignant it was. But because her father was so stern, she wasn't allowed to cry for it at dinner that night. She just had to go to the butcher and bring back the meat. She writes, I would not cry for this bunny or for anyone else for almost 40 years. It finally happened in a workshop in Hawaii. During the week, the landlord nickeled and dimed me for everything. For the next 5 days, I felt unbelievable rage toward this man, so much that I wanted to kill him. I struggled to contain the rage so it wouldn't ruin the workshop. And when I arrived back home, my friends confronted me on my anger. After some resistance, I talked out my anger and was shocked to find myself suddenly sobbing. The rage gave way to a deep sorrow underneath. And as I cried, I realized this wasn't only about the landlord. His cheapness had been the trigger that reminded me of my all too thrifty father. I was suddenly that little girl crying over Blackie. Over the next few days, I cried for him and all the other losses that had gone ungrieved. And so I think what this story illustrates is that all of our grief has a past and all of it has a future. It finds its place on the timeline of our life. One loss often triggers other losses that have preceded it. I find this in my work as a chaplain when I'm working with a family whose parent is dying and they find that all of a sudden they're thinking about their other parent who died 10 years previously. or people who experience the end of a relationship might find themselves all of a sudden wondering whatever happened to all of the other people they've been with over the years and reflecting on other relationships that have ended. One loss can trigger so many other not fully processed losses in the past. And there's kind of a poetic way of putting this by the poet Jack Gilbert, who says in a poem, maybe when something stops, something lost in us can be heard. Maybe when something stops, something lost in us can be heard. So one way that I want to frame this conversation about grief in times of pandemic is, what are the other past griefs we've experienced that might be rearing their heads at this time when so much in life and in our world has come to a grinding halt? Might this time of COVID trigger other times of loneliness or isolation that we've experienced? Other times when we felt out of control. Other times when we worried for our mental health. Other times when we felt like our life was being wasted or was passing us by because we couldn't do what we wanted to be doing. Other times of personal or collective trauma. Other times when we felt despair for the earth, the society, or the world. Or other times when illness or tragedy kept us from participating in something meaningful. There's a lot on this slide, and it's very normal for reflection on any one aspect of our grief to take us into a whole world of reflection. Feel free at any point. This webinar will be recorded. You can return to it, and I'll build in times when we can kind of stop for a pause, but to really honor whatever our experience might be as we're thinking about some of these dimensions of loss. And of course, it's individual for everybody. Young people might experience this life being wasted piece as, I was really looking for a life partner. I felt myself getting old. I wanted to be dating, and now there's these months when I can't do that. Someone in a later stage of life who might even be terminally ill might say, everyone is so disappointed that events have been canceled, but I was actually staking the meaning of my life. I was living, trying to reach a certain milestone, be it seeing my grandchild graduate from college or get married, and now that event is off. So we're going to experience all of these in our own individual ways, whether it's people losing jobs, people losing businesses or retirement savings in the stock market, students who have prepared long years for a job in academia and now their professional future seems in question. But all of these, I guess what I want to suggest in thinking about grief on the scale of this big timeline are different iterations of these big themes that we experience over and over in our life. The loss of control, the loss of normalcy or of a routine, the loss of time. Will all be changed by this, just as this experience might trigger other griefs. So too, other things that we experience for the rest of our life will remind us in some way, shape, or form, not that it has to plunge us into trauma, but undoubtedly, other things will remind us of this time. And so I think it's good to be talking about and naming our grief so that when that time comes, we have a sense of, well, is this something I need to look at? Is the experience of grieving and coping that I'm going through now something that can make me stronger so that the next time I have to grieve something like this, I'll have a sense of resilience? There's been a lot here. So as I come to this image, which is a contemporary depiction of the Sacred Heart, we might just take a moment to pause, check in with our own heart, if it helps to place a hand over our own heart, to see if there's anything moving in there, as I've named some of the different griefs that we might be experiencing. Just to take a moment, feel the holes or apertures in our own heart. They might start off as wounds, but those apertures can become places that speak to us, or places from which love can pour out. So let's just take a moment to ground ourselves and think about, what are the griefs that I'm carrying now that I want to think about for the rest of this talk? So much reverence for each of you. Each of us has a story. Each of us has a history of joy and pain. And I just want to reverence whatever it is that each of us is bringing to this moment. 3 points that I want to make, 3 reminders as we continue on in our exploration together. Of everything I'm about to say, nothing here is a universal prescription or saying this is something you should be feeling or experiencing. All of our grief is personal and specific. You know, some people during this time of COVID will grieve that a loved one has died and that they're not there to provide support during this time. I've talked to other people who have recently lost loved ones, and they say, I just thank God this loved one of mine died before this happened so they don't have to go through it. 2 completely legitimate ways to experience this. Some people might feel that their home isn't safe, and that's a tremendous thing to grieve, is the ability to get out of the home or to feel safe somewhere else. Others might feel, I have a friend actually who said, you know, I think I'm going to grieve when this is over, because for the first time, my spouse, who's normally at work, my kids who are normally at school, we're all home together, and it's actually working for her, and they're really enjoying this time. That might not be the case for everyone. All grief is personal and specific, and I just want to honor whatever it is for you. None of these are universal prescriptions. The other thing I want to say is that if any of this gets to be too much, it's okay not to process our grief or to try to process our grief before we're ready to do so. It's all right if something surfaces, just to acknowledge it and then to say, you know, I'm going to put this into my back pocket until I'm ready. And maybe what I need right now isn't even to continue listening to this webinar, but to call a friend or to watch a funny clip on YouTube or to go outside if it's sunny out and be in the sun. We know when we're ready for it. So I want to offer that permission. And it's because grief work is not meant to cause pain. It's meant fundamentally to be an invitation to growth and healing. It's not to say it'll be easy. It's not to say that it'll be pain-free. But grief itself is not our enemy. Grief is our own spirit's best attempt to respond to the antagonism of loss. Grief is our own spirit's attempt to heal. So our grieving is good, it's natural, it's normal. It's not easy, but it's sacred. It's really sacred. Okay. So I've named a few discrete losses. Let me offer a few other broader concepts and try to interpret them in light of our experience of COVID. Considerations that might help us to understand what exactly it is we're going through when we talk about different kinds of loss and grief. This is Pauline Boss, who's just a great one. Her books are wonderful. She has a terrific interview with Krista Tippett in the On Being podcast, in which she talks about the myth of closure. It's again this idea that our grief never fully ends. It exists on this timeline. Other things in the future will activate past griefs. But maybe our relationship, if we're processing our grief, our way of holding it or relating to it might change over time. She has this wonderful notion of ambiguous loss. And ambiguous loss, her research started when she was talking about people who had been killed in war in Vietnam. And she looked at the experience of families that were grieving them, and she realized these people who were killed were physically absent, but psychologically very present. Often there was a shrine in the house devoted to them, or, you know, you kept that chair empty at the dinner table. They had a profound psychological presence. And then she started studying veterans and eventually people who suffer from dementia. And she realized, wow, this is a case where it's really flipped around, where you have people who are physically present, but perhaps psychologically absent. People with dementia who have forgotten who their loved ones are, or veterans whose mind is just elsewhere as a result of the dissociation that comes with trauma. And that ambiguous loss is a term for these weird alternations of presence and absence. So I was thinking here, what does that look like in a time of pandemic? On the one hand, we have these relationships with others that we can still hang on to, but they're virtual. So a lot of the people that we're talking to, even over Zoom, we're having a relationship with them, but we're not able to reach out and touch them, hug them, shake their hand. As in this beautiful painting by the famous Italian painter De Chirico, who paints all of these empty piazzas in Italy. We have a whole world that exists outside our window. The world hasn't been lost, but it's empty. Our streets are empty. There's these weird kind of interlacings of presence and absence. And how do we relate to those things that are right there? We might even be able to go outside and keep our distance 6 feet from one another, but the place isn't filled with the people that we're used to being. So is it even the same place anymore? I was even thinking about the virus itself. It has this tremendous psychological presence. It seems to be everywhere. And yet, do we have it? There's not necessarily adequate testing. We might not even know. It's this invisible, indetectable virus. We don't actually know where it is. So we might assume that everyone we meet has it, and yet they might not. So often our loss is very ambiguous. And by the way, I happen to think that this is going to be a particularly present element of our experience when we begin to transition out of the sheltering. I find myself, I think in my own grief, I've realized I'm grieving more the thought of going back into society than actually I grieved when I was hunkering down, because I'm going to be entering into a world that's not quite the same as it used to be. Parts of it will seem the same, but there'll always be this doubt. Is the virus going to come back? Is what I'm doing safe? I have the feeling that particularly in the next stage of our human and social experience, there's going to be a lot of ambiguous loss. We're going to regain things that are kind of present, but we're still going to be marked by the fact that they were absent for a while and that we might have to go into sheltering again. So I think that ambiguous loss, although Pauline Boss writes about it in terms of people with dementia or veterans, I think we can consider it a part of our experience of COVID. And this is a slide that's kind of elaborating or just restating some of what I've already talked about. And Pauline Boss, when she talks about people, especially caregivers of people with dementia, she says often their experience is an experience of living with ambiguity, with imperfection, of having to say, you know, I still have a relationship with my mother who's got dementia, for example, but it's not the same as it was before. It's really an imperfect relationship. And can I come to terms with the fact that this is an imperfect relationship and always will be compared to what I had before? It involves a lot of living in a kind of weird in-between. That an important part of coping with ambiguous loss is being able to hold the ambiguity, accept the imperfect, accept that we're living in the in-between. This is a painting by Gustav Klimt, The Tree of Life. I have a dear friend who loves this painting, and she told me a story once. She had it hanging above her bed. And when she was a younger woman, before she got married and she was longing to find a partner, she would look up at this painting and say, this is how I imagine my life to be. On the left-hand side, you have a person who's alone, who's looking hopefully into the future, perhaps looking for connection. And she said, I know I'll live through life. And so the second part of this kind of panel is the tree of life. I'll live through life and eventually I'll find the person I'm meant to be with, and I'll be there with my beloved on the right. And she said tears came to her one day when she realized she was looking at the painting wrong. That it's not meant to be read from left to right, but all at once. That the painting is a way of saying that life, the tree of life, grows forth out of the tension between longing and possession, absence and presence, desire and fulfillment. This is the stuff of life. This is the tension of life. We really do live so much of our life in the in-betweenness. And there's a lot to be learned here, I think, for our meaning making. We might not have control over whether in a given day we're in the absence side or the present side, the satisfaction side or the longing side. Some days will come about and they'll just be bad days. But can we accept that? Can we live with the knowledge that life itself is born out of that tension? We don't have control necessarily over many of the factors that we imagine would give our life closure, but we do have control over the meaning that we attribute to our life, the meaning that we make out of the fact that life involves these alternations between loss and relief. That's where our freedom comes in, is really in the area of meaning making. There's a lot we don't have control over these days. We don't have control over the economy. We don't have control over what various politicians say about reopening. But how do we stand in the midst of all of that ambiguity? It's a beautiful painting. And I don't think that image in the lower right is a QR code. Klimt would be about 100 years ahead of his time if that's what that were. But what a beautiful painting. So we can consider, as we're in the midst of this ambiguity, are there times in our life when we've had to deal with ambiguity before? What do we learn from that can help us to navigate this particular constellation of losses these days? Ambiguous loss is really quite related to another term or experience in the grief literature called anticipatory grief. Again, caregivers of people with chronic illness, whether it's dementia or anything, often find themselves in the experience of saying, you know, a part of me wants my loved one to live forever. A part of me, and this might be really hard for them to name, wants them to be able to go and be with God or to be at peace so that I can get on with my life. It's very, very hard to live in the present in the midst of a prolonged situation, but also somehow be preparing for a future that we know will come when we know we're going to grieve. And having the awareness that we're going to grieve someday hanging over our head can be a tremendously difficult burden to bear. So we can have this experience of anticipatory grief where even before we've lost something, we're already leaning into that loss and beginning to experience it. So anticipatory grief is future-oriented. It may express itself as anxiety. Anxiety particularly because we're not exactly sure what it's going to be like when it strikes. Again, I come out of the medical profession, I work in healthcare, so a lot of my analogies are drawn from that. But so often I've heard patients say when they're awaiting a diagnosis or something or a prognosis, you know, it's the not knowing that's hardest. Once we know what to prepare ourselves for, we can start to prepare ourselves. We can draw on the sources of strength that we'll need. We can kind of figure out where we are in this story that's being told. But when we don't know what direction we're going to take or what the timeline is going to be, where do we stand? How do we prepare ourselves? How do we position ourselves in writing our story? And here we are in times of COVID in this massive collective state of prolonged uncertainty. Is a vaccine going to come in a year and a half? Is it going to be more years than that? Are any of these miracle drugs actually going to help us and provide relief even sooner? We're just not sure, but we're anticipating a grief that we're not exactly sure how we're going to process. So if you feel anxiety, it can be good to name that, to name the grief dimension of that. And I think people who work with folks who are in this position would say it's really the importance of mindfulness, rooting in the present moment. How am I feeling today? What can I do today? I am where my feet is. I'm here today and I'm not there tomorrow. I think this is what Jesus was talking about when he talks about, let tomorrow take care of itself. Tomorrow has enough worries. We kind of root in the present moment as much as possible. And insofar as we're thinking about the future, that's natural. Everything I've just described is so natural. Do we have a sense of hopefulness? Can we grieve in such a way that we're preparing ourselves so that we see the good that will come in the future alongside the bad? And we say, okay, here's maybe when this is over, here's what I'd like to celebrate at some point, to be aware that there'll be freedom and celebration in the future and not just grief. These are a few things that people who are walking with people in anticipatory grief might consider. It's okay if we're not there yet. Again, we're each in our own place in this timeline. I want to name another kind of grief. You won't see this term necessarily in the clinical literature, but I think you'll see reflections of it when people talk about grief. I'm borrowing the term civic sadness from the French existentialist writer Albert Camus. Civic sadness, in other words, we look around ourselves, and I've heard this from so many people, and we feel a sense of despair or sadness for the world itself, for society, for the planet. Insofar as we grasp that there won't really be a normal that we return to fully, that our generation and future generations will be marked by this. When we consider, some of us, when we are thinking about things that are happening in this century, looming ecological disaster, or the way that social media makes so many extreme human rights abuses visible, we might experience this pandemic as just another sign that so much is happening in the world that breaks our heart. Not just insofar as it affects us, but insofar as it affects humanity, the planet, animal species that might go extinct in the next century. Profound grief, civic sadness, and that's a really big one that we don't have a lot of control over, although perhaps we can do things in terms of our activism or so on. We do have some agency, but we can really be overwhelmed by the immensity of grief in our world and our own smallness in the face of it. This is a grief that can manifest itself as guilt. Guilt over inaction, guilt over, quote unquote, not doing enough to heal this broken world or to save it from disaster. We might even feel grief over happiness. I've seen people post on social media things like, I'm so sorry to share good news when people are suffering so much, but I just got this new job, or but I just got engaged. And there's such a warm, tender human attention in those kinds of posts to the way that others are suffering, and a desire not to gloat. So it's not a judgment on that kind of post, but I do want to acknowledge that many of us will feel guilt at even celebrating good news in the face of this cosmic or this planetary, this civic sadness. And so to be able to pay attention to those signs of guilt and be able to name those too as grief. The last point of this slide, I mentioned a wonderful book that I'd recommend to anyone for whom this particular concept is important or seems to be touching something, by the, I believe, clinical social worker, Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, who wrote a book called Trauma Stewardship. And it's really about how we take care of ourselves in the face of massive exposure to suffering, whether it's we're working in a caring profession, or whether it's we have a particular sensitivity to, again, this civic sadness, this planetary sadness. She offers some really wonderful suggestions. One of which I would say is there's some things that it's important to be able to surrender control over. None of us can possibly save the planet alone. And the importance of being able to accept that and surrender that so that we're not carrying the weight of responsibility for everything that happens to other people. And somehow balancing that surrender of control with an appropriate acceptance of where we do have agency. What can we do? I'm thinking of one Holocaust survivor who said very movingly, the Nazis took away so much, especially of our freedom. But every day I woke up and reminded myself, I can choose whether I put my left foot forward first, or my right foot forward. Even starting on that super granular level, we can realize we do have something like freedom. And even if it's on a small scale, we do have agency to do some things. And so as we're caring for ourselves in the midst of this civic sadness, to ask ourselves a question, what can I do? And what is it useful for me to surrender? I'll say more about that in a few minutes as we approach the final part of our conversation together, of our time together. I also want to say on this point of civic sadness that often in the guilt that's involved in it, we get involved in a lot of comparisons. We say, well, my suffering isn't as great as somebody else's, and I feel guilty over it. Or we might say, I feel a lot of pain and suffering that others don't seem to be recognizing. And we might say, should I share my joy, or should I share my sadness with somebody else who might be happy and not want to hear about it, or might be suffering enough? So all these comparisons, they can kind of come into play. And the importance, I think, as we ask ourselves, what do we do with that sadness, of kind of recognizing compassionately and offering compassion to ourselves. Let's not hierarchize. Let's not try to rank our sadness compared to others. That doesn't really lead to compassion. It leads to guilt. But to say whatever it is that I'm suffering, little or small, it is part of the human experience of suffering. It is part of what makes me and everybody human. And I don't need to compare my suffering to others to say, well, we're all human. We all carry in some form or another this weight of suffering. Can I unite my suffering with that of humanity? And conversely, when I experience joy or happiness, when I see something beautiful, that's part of the humanity of people who are suffering too. We all have this gift, this ability, however buried it might be by our own traumas, to experience beauty. We all deserve to experience beauty. So if I have some joy or a sense of beauty in my life, can I offer this up and unite it to the capacity for beauty and joy of all humanity? Can I see myself less as an individual carrying a burden and more as part of this wonderfully interconnected planet that's filled with both joy and sorrow? More about that in that book and in a few other resources I'll share a little bit later. Let me name one final dimension of loss, and this is spiritual loss. There's the obvious, right? Many of us who would normally turn to our religious communities or practices in order to cope might feel, in the words of one person who put it to me, cut off from the sacred, because we can't go to synagogue, church, temple, mosque over the weekend like we're used to. We might not even be able to celebrate funerals at the end of life. There can be a loss of some of the sources of spirituality that sustain us. But also, we might be asking the question, where is God in all this? I'm told that pastors, chaplains after 9/11 heard the theodicy question. In other words, the where is God in all this question more often than they'd ever heard in their career. And I'm starting to hear that now as I talk to people. I think we're really hearing and experiencing together this sense that something's being shaken in us. We're asking this question of God. So spiritual loss, in the sense that some of the presumptions we might have had about the basic ordering of the universe or about how God interacts with humanity, might be shaken in this. And I chose this image, which is called Thicket by a contemporary artist, because it reminds me of two quotes from John of the Cross in the Christian tradition, who uses the word thicket to talk about this experience of spiritual suffering. John of the Cross writes, "The Apostle Paul said of Christ, 'In him are hidden all the treasures of the wisdom and knowledge of God. Yet the soul cannot enter into these treasures, nor attain them, unless it first crosses into the thicket of suffering.'" And again, the thicket of the wisdom and knowledge of God is so deep and so immense that the soul, however much it knows of it, can always penetrate further within it because it is so immense and so incomprehensible. So many of us will have this experience as we lose some of our customary spiritual bearings of entering into a thicket. This is where dark night of the soul spirituality comes in really helpfully. We might find ourselves in this period of spiritual darkness. And according to some of the mystics, this is a time when really what's happening is old images of God are falling away so that new ones can emerge. But that's a process that takes time. So if we can remind ourselves to be patient, honor our spiritual loss, honor the loss of some of our kind of bearings, but with the hope and the trust that something new will be born if we trust in the inexhaustible richness of the divine mystery. I wanted to share this image. Sometimes when I'm doing a PowerPoint, I throw in images just because I can't resist sharing a beautiful image. We'll see if this is related to what I'm talking about. But this is my favorite painter, Chagall, depicting Noah's reception of the order from God to build the ark. In the face of disaster, Noah was able to discern, what's my role here in providing an ark that can shelter others? So what's the ark that we want to build for ourselves? Where might we discern God's invitation, not to stick with what's old and what we're accustomed to, but to build something new? I hesitate to say much more about that because we tread now on such sacred ground involving people's images and relationships with the divine, which are all so personal. So I really leave that as an open question and not one that I want to insist on too much. But as we stop for a moment, and we're about to enter into the kind of concluding remarks here in terms of coping, maybe we can pause on this image, on the hand of this angel who's pointing us into the future as we ask ourselves, is there an arc of meaning, of purpose, a project, something that I want to begin to construct or build for myself as the rains come? And so let me move into our final piece here. I wish that I could say, give the solution to grief in 5 minutes or in 5 slides, as it were. I'm just going to shoot through a few slides about coping, and each of them will be fairly simple, but maybe as we end this webinar, each of us will kind of take one of those slides that might provide a way forward. And I just want to say, in all things, balance. So coping, intuitive and instrumental grieving, these are kind of technical words, meaning some of us grieve by expressing emotion. Some of us might not, and that's okay. Some of us will express our grief or experience grief as more of a cognitive confusion. We're not really sure how to find our bearings, and we might not cry over grief, although crying over grief is fine, as is getting angry, as is being afraid, as is experiencing any emotion. We might experience grief on a cognitive level. Others might experience grief as an invitation to action. Rather than to feel something, we want to do something. We want to make something out of this experience. We want to create a scholarship fund for someone who's died or something like that. And that's okay too. Some of us might experience grief through ritual, whether that's a religious ritual, lighting a candle at the end of every day and spending some moments in prayer. I've known of some people who put a jar of beans at times of traditions and then an empty jar, and every day they move a bean into the empty jar as a way of symbolizing, yes, something of my old self is changing or being lost, but there's also the construction of a new self here. And for others, ritual will look like, every Thursday we're going to do a family movie night or something where we each watch a movie and then come together on FaceTime and discuss it. In all things balance, but to feel free to grieve emotionally, cognitively, could be writing or journaling or trying to make meaning of the narrative. actively, ritualistically. I've already spoken a little bit about moral resilience, which is giving ourselves permission to surrender our control over some things while rooting ourselves in what we do have control over and where we do have agency. There's a focusing question that the Buddhist Roshi Joan Halifax suggests we ask. Consider in each moment what's really serving us or what will serve us as we decide whether our particular course of action is worth our time and energy. Is this something for me to surrender or something that can actually give me a healthy sense of agency? I'm going fast through these. Any of these we could spend much more time on. I think we are strong to the extent that we know our own story. So in addition to all of the work we've done together today, saying what have we lost and what do we need to grieve, there's also room to say, in the midst of change, what has remained? What have we not lost? And who are we in our core that we can still acknowledge and cherish and draw strength from that hasn't changed at the core of who we are? And is there even newness? What are we becoming or discovering in ourselves that we didn't know was there as resilient or expansive beings? So the balance in this slide is knowing what we have to grieve, but also knowing what we can hold on to that's remained and knowing what it is that we might be discovering that's new in us. Another schema that speaks to balance, when people talk about grief, they might talk about the dual process model of grief, which is basically just saying we can oscillate between processing loss and then also distracting ourselves from it and just reinvesting in life. Knowing that we don't have to remain rooted in grief and loss and always talking about it. It's okay to be distracted. But also if our tendency is just to try to distract ourselves and not to think about it, it's okay to dip into the processing and do some of that and then come back to however it is that we're wanting to reinvest in life. And each of us might have a sense in our own support networks. Where do we need to lean into the people who help us process? Where do we need to lean into the people who can distract us just by making us laugh or sharing a hobby or something that takes our mind off of things? And then this is how I want to end. And first of all, I want to say, bless you all. If anyone's made it to the end of this hour of grief, it can be a lot. And so I want to end with just a minute or two of self-compassion and kind of an exercise. So I'm going to put one final image on the screen. This is an invitation to come back to our chair, come back to our computer screen, come back to this tab, and to rest our eyes on this image as together we offer some compassion to ourselves. I'm going to suggest that we find a comfortable position. This will only take a minute or two, although you can do it for longer after we're done together. And just breathe, just to give ourselves permission to breathe. There's been a lot, perhaps, of feelings, a lot of thoughts. But let's just breathe. In and out. And whatever grief feels like in us, we're going to speak to it. When I say grief, I invite you to hear your own grief. I also invite you to hear if there's another name that you'd like to give to whatever you're feeling within you right now as we do this exercise together. It could be fear, it could be anger, it could be sorrow, it could be pain. Just as we breathe, whatever we become aware of in us that we want to speak to and offer ourselves compassion in the midst of. Just invite you to hear that whenever you hear me say grief. So taking a deep breath in, if nothing else has come out of this, may we say on the in-breath, I know you are there, my grief. I know you are there, my grief, or pain or anger. And on the out breath, I will take care of you. I know you are there, my grief. I will take care of you. What words of compassion to offer ourselves, whatever our experience of this hour has been. So just pause for 30, 40 seconds of silence as we breathe. I know you are there, my grief. I will take care of you. Thank you for being on this journey with me, and again with everybody else who we don't see, but who's tuned in with us at this time. And really from the bottom of my heart, I thank you, and most of all, I wish you well. Please be safe. Please be well. May you be healed.
Thank you, Nicholas, for giving us some very real and practical insights on how we may be dealing with grief. I think you've helped make a very complex issue a bit easier for us to address, and the artwork was especially beautiful and helpful. I want to mention again that this presentation has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for future viewing. And finally, thanks to each of you for joining us this afternoon, and also for your ministry to one another. I hope you leave today's presentation feeling encouraged and refreshed, and we wish you peace, health, and wholeness as you go through the rest of your day. Take care.